My guest today is someone whose work I have admired and paid attention to for a long time. And so I am excited to have him here on the podcast to interrogate and ask a lot of questions about his current and past work. This is Jay Joseph. Jay Joseph, PsyD, is a clinical psychologist practicing in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's written critically about genetic research in the social and behavioral sciences continuously since the late 1990s, and he's critical of medical models of human psychological distress and dysfunction. He's the author of 4 books, most recently Schizophrenia and Genetics, The End of an Illusion, published in 2023. A complete list of his books, book chapters, and peer-reviewed articles can be found on his website, which is in the links below this episode. And many of his online articles can also be found on the Mad in America website. And I think was that founded by Robert Whitaker, or is that
Yes, Robert Whitaker,
reflective of
yes.
his works?
Someone who I admire greatly, yes.
Yeah, and a lot of listeners will be familiar with him because we talk about Anatomy of an Epidemic often on the other podcast, and so he's a familiar source to many of us. So yeah, and I originally found you, I believe, because you were in a footnote in Gabor Mate's book, maybe the newest one, maybe the Myth and Normal book, where I was wondering if there were serious critiques of the twin studies literature, because, I had sort of been brought into the twin studies literature as if this is just gospel. This is, this unassailable gospel. There really are no valid critiques out there. And so that was the first place that I encountered some of the work that you're doing. And I'm hopeful we can talk about that today, especially in the context of your recent critique of the bell curve, and also how it informs your other critiques of the genetic origins of psychiatric diagnoses and all of that. But we can kind of see where it takes us. So I guess the where we can maybe begin is what initially motivated you to kind of dive into the realm of critiquing this sacred cow of the twin studies, just where did that come from, and how did you get started with that?
In the mid-90s, I was in a doctoral clinical psychology program and became acquainted with some of the works of critics of psychiatry and medical models. And I would always see popping up that twin studies and genetic research was always being cited. And I got more into twin research, and I said, this is obviously wrong. The assumption of this research is obviously wrong. So there must be all these great critiques about it. And there are a few. So there's some outstanding authors who have critiqued it. Leon Kamen, Don Jackson, others, but not as much as I would have liked to have seen. So I did my dissertation on the genetics of schizophrenia. So I reviewed the genetic literature on schizophrenia, which is supposedly a highly heritable disorder, supposedly, keyword. And so I got more into it, and I really saw that obviously that the research was bad. The assumption of twin research, that identical and fraternal twins grow up experiencing equal environments, was obviously false. And the twin researchers who tried to justify the assumption, their arguments were kind of weak. So, and that was in the late 90s. And I've been really doing that ever since, nonstop, looking at genetic research, because not that many people are doing it. So I felt kind of a duty to continue doing these critiques.
Yeah, I think most people listening are familiar with the general idea of when we refer to the twin studies, what that means. But twin studies encompasses a variety of methodologies and approaches. And I think the intuition that people have when they think of a twin study is this very ideal, typical. You've got monozygotic twins who are separated the moment of birth, and immediately spirited away to totally opposite sides of the tracks, never to encounter each other or to share anything in common ever again. And this really, from your work and from the other critiques I've read, is something that essentially never happens. It's never that cut and dried. The twins are usually much older when they're separated. The messiness of the separation, of course, as soon as you think about this would have to be the case. Either the mothers died in childbirth or shortly thereafter, or the twins are going to live with relatives. And, there's just all of this. They're going to the same school. They have friends in common. They're typically in the same SES sort of situation. And so I think this kind of idea that this is I think you call it the Rosetta Stone in your latest article, that the twin studies are the Rosetta Stone of teasing out nature from nurture. It's just not that straightforward. There's a lot of methodological messiness is how I would characterize it. And that seems to be the essence of your critique of the bell curve, which is, of course, this very infamous book by Herrnstein and Murray that came out 30 years ago, and you're now kind of bringing back a critique of it that really does seem premised primarily on these problematic assumptions and methodologies of identical twins raised apart in particular, but also the twins raised together literature. So what motivated the sort of revisitation of Murray's work in particular, and what were the biggest problematic findings about it that you wanted to zero in on?
Yeah, I would like to get to that. One thing I do want to make clear is that in psychiatry, all the studies are twins reared together. So they're reared together, identical, versus you reared together fraternal twins, and then they compare those. So in all psychiatric disorders, conditions, whatever diagnoses, these are all twins reared together. So only for IQ mainly and personality and a few other psychological characteristics do they do the reared apart twin studies. So I just want to be clear, when we go back to psychiatry, there are no reared apart twin studies in psychiatry,
Well,
other than individual case histories that people find.
Yeah, that was a clarification that I got from your article as well, that there just really are not that many twins reared apart studies at all. This is something that just doesn't happen that often.
Right.
And so the ones that do exist are outdated, deeply problematic in some cases, possibly just made up and invented out of whole cloth.
Yes.
And at best are leading to effect sizes and estimates that are probably way overblown. But that is what the bell curve is built on, is the twins reared apart, correct? Like that's
yes, that's what motivated me. And I do have a co-author, Ken Richardson, who played a great role in that article.
I just started reading his book too. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Great. But the bell curve is a very controversial book, and I've developed a critique of the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, in particular, and twins reared apart studies in the last few years. And then when I went back and reread the bell curve, I saw that the main evidence they presented in favor of the substantial heritability, quote unquote, of IQ are the reared apart twin studies. They did mention reared together twin studies, adoption studies. They didn't cite any. So they did cite other evidence, but the main evidence they cited was the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, pretty much. So since I developed my critique, I could kind of go in and integrate that critique and show that the evidence that they presented in favor of actually above, I don't use the word heritability, so that's a very controversial topic. But if I use the language they use, I would say, above zero heritability, there's no evidence from reared apart twin studies, and particularly integrating my critique of the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. So in that article, we kind of argued that there's no evidence, not just between group, ethnic group, but even within group evidence, there's no evidence from those studies. So I integrated that in, and it's, the 30th anniversary of the bell curve. So it seemed like a good opportunity to come out with it.
Yeah, there's certainly, the bell curve has had no shortage of its critics over the years. And when I first encountered it in grad school in political science, it was very much considered debunked. It was really not taken seriously in the circles that I was running in. But it does continue to have a cult following. It definitely does continue to influence a lot of potential powerful influencers who continue to use it. And so I think it's a really remarkable critique that you're, as you say, even though many people have come after it, very few people have come after the inference that the within group variation is driven genetically. And you're even saying that is founded on a house of cards that doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
I'm saying that, yes.
And so that's a pretty big claim. It's a claim that Murray himself seems to make in his more recent book, his human diversity book. So even he's pointing out that the twins reared apart studies, which the bell curve is built on, are you can only get so much inference out of them, and he's more interested now in the other types of twin studies or the polygenic studies that are coming forward, which seems to raise all kinds of questions about his own work in the past. But of course, that connection doesn't get made in the new work. So.
That was a huge reversal, because the bell curve was built upon reared apart twin studies, and now he's saying really they're not that great, but reared
Right.
together twin studies, which is a big reversal, which he didn't really comment or say that it was, but it was.
Just to kind of, because I know this can be so confusing to people who are not, in deep in the weeds of this research and who really have a passion for understanding this type of research. It seems self-evident what the difference between twins reared apart and twins reared together would be, but can you sort of describe what each of those research designs are trying to do and how they're trying to control for the different
Yes.
factors that might make a difference? Because the ideal typical idea of the twins are separated at birth, raised in different families, really does seem to be pretty easy to grasp for people, that
Yes.
would indicate if there's any difference here, it would have to be all environmental, because
Yeah.
that's the only variation that you're seeing, because they have identical.
Yes.
But the kind of work that Murray and others are pointing to as more valid, and that you're also pointing to in the rest of the world of psychiatry and these other measures, is the twins reared together. How do you start to tease out those effects if you're looking at twins that are growing up in the same household?
So, yeah, so what researchers do is they take a group of identical twins, let's say 100 pairs, and then they take 100 pairs. It's different numbers, so just to make it simple. 100 pairs of reared together dizygotic fraternal twins. And then they do, for example, an IQ correlation, or for psychiatry, they do concordance rate, which means when one has it, does the second twin have it? And they notice that there's a difference. Say in schizophrenia, it's 40% identical twin concordance, 8% fraternal, or IQ would be 60% correlation, IQ correlation versus 30. I'm just kind of throwing out numbers. So they would say that genetics is the only explanation for these different behavioral resemblances. However, this is based on an assumption that identical and fraternal twins grow up experiencing the same environments. There's no difference in the environment between these twins, which is completely false. Even most twin researchers admit that the environments are very different. Then they go into a series of theoretical statements why the equal environment assumption still holds, but it's based on a false assumption. So we could interpret the results of identical twin behavioral resemblance environmentally. We could say that their environments are much more similar, so their behavior resembles much more similar compared to dizygotic twins. So this is fundamental assumption of twin studies reared together is false, and therefore any genetic interpretation of the results is not supported. It's not. It could just be. It's a twin study does not disentangle potential genetic and environmental influences, even though it is claimed that it does. So all the textbooks are wrong. All the behavioral textbooks, psychiatry textbooks, they all cite these studies as gospel, as you said. But they may be gospel, but they're not true gospel, so that it's they don't prove anything about genetics. And so if the underlying assumption is false, and genetic interpretation of the results are therefore false in studies of reared together twins.
And everything about it, as you and others point out as well, is just very tautological. It's very circular reasoning, because the comeback that you'll often hear in the equal environments assumption is that, well, it's genetic factors that are driving the person to select a certain kind of environment. So you're using the thing that you're trying to explain the thing, and it all is just this big loop that never ends. And there's as you point out, there's really no way to disentangle this. You can't just wave your arms around and say, okay, well, let's just assign some arbitrary percentage of the variance here to explain what's happening. It's probably a lot of garbage assumptions in, garbage assumptions out happening.
Yes.
One of the lines in your paper that really struck me was that even twin researchers themselves in the behavioral genetics world, Robert Plomin and the rest of them, will admit that each of these research designs and practices is flawed and limited and has issues with the assumptions. But then they turn around and want to say, but the aggregate sum of all of this data still points us in this direction. And I think that can be a very compelling comeback until you think, well, no, if all of these are wrong, that doesn't add up to a right. We just have a big steaming pile of wrong. And
Yes,
so,
you cannot. Yes,
yeah, yeah,
I mean, if you're looking at a particular research method, it has to stand or fall on its own.
right.
It's a long used technique of pseudoscience to take something that doesn't really have much evidence in its favor. I could say phrenology is valid because it converges with other types of behavioral research. A research method must stand and fall on its own, and I argue, and others also argue, that behavioral genetics methods are all severely flawed and based on false assumptions. So there's no converging evidence. The evidence is all
Right.
bad, inconclusive at best.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, the line was the bad science combined does not add up to good science, which I
Yes.
really appreciate that.
Well,
So,
thank you. Thank you.
yeah,
Can I say something else about the bell
of
curve?
course,
Yeah.
please. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of the debunking of the bell curve and the controversy was about ethnic differences, okay, American
Mhm,
blacks and whites, that there's a
mhm,
genetic component to that. That was what really set off the controversy. Otherwise, and the IQ really predicts everything in life and it's all powerful. As far as
mhm,
whatever the genetic influence within groups, and so let's say 60% IQ heritability, which again, I don't recognize the heritability concept, but they use that all the time.
mhm.
That was not controversial. That will be in every psychology text. So, that IQ, cognitive ability, has a substantial genetic component based on twin studies. So that part is not controversial. It was mainly the ethnic differences part and the publicity that it got. So because it was publicized in the media, a lot of people had to respond, whether as opposed to a crackpot book that nobody really paid attention to, a lot wouldn't have got as much response. But because the media played it up and put it on magazine covers and these kinds of things, it
Mhm.
became something important. So it was more the ethnic differences and also the aspect of there was a eugenic aspect that if we don't do something about breeding, we're going to have the genetically stratified society and it's going to have negative consequences for the country.
Right, right.
When I
You
say
look.
country, it was mainly about the United States, so that's why I said it.
Yeah, yeah. The
Mhm.
bell curve itself is, very little of it is explicitly about race. It's
Mhm.
really only a couple of pages. It is mostly
Mhm.
this argument about the rise of the so-called cognitive elite and
Mhm.
the kind of subjugation of the underclass and all of that and what that pretends for the stability of the
Mhm.
country. But, the question is always how much of that, obviously there is a great divide, right? There is a great divide that does map onto observed racial differences and class differences,
Mhm.
in how we would measure intelligence, typically through IQ testing or just observationally through inequality, educational attainment, all of the kind of proxy measures that we would use. It is you're living in denial if you don't observe that there is something that correlates with a racial difference in the
Mhm.
United States. And the evergreen question is how much of that is being driven by very deliberate policy choices that sort of leverage pre-existing subjugation of certain groups, and how much of that is some sort of innate genetically driven difference. And
Yeah.
it's kind of beyond the scope of at least this article, to get into that and what those determinants have been. Do you have a sense of what some of the biggest smoking guns are for inequality in the US and beyond?
Political policies,
Mm-hmm.
not genetics, not biology, but political policies. The United
Yeah.
States is the richest country in the world. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars not to improve education, free education, healthcare, housing, solve homelessness. They're giving it to other countries to fight wars. And
Yeah.
even if they weren't, they're not really spending money to improve the environment. One way to justify that is to say that people are biologically in their place. Even homelessness, which there's no reason why there should be hundreds of thousands of homeless people in the United States. That could easily be changed by political policies with
Mm-hmm.
public housing, rent control, all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a decision not to, and the genetic theories are promoted as a justification for not doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I even saw one study that claimed that there's aspect of homelessness as a genetic component. You
Oh,
could,
sure. Everything has
yes.
yeah, I remember as a very green student in grad
Mhm.
school, coming across the genetic determinants of political affiliation, that
Mhm.
basically we can give a heritability estimate for whether you're a Democrat or not. And
Yes.
that is a very mean, this is just, again, sort of in the canon at this point, as, real scientists ascribe heritability variance to these kinds of things, and anything else is just woo-woo blank slate kind of thinking. So it's an interesting,
all based on rear together twin study.
right, of course, which
The political
are,
affiliation, it's all based on rear together twin studies. Yes.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, continue. Go ahead.
No, it's there's an interesting sort of disconnect, because you don't find people speaking about the basis of those sorts of policy decisions openly. So, people who are in high level political positions are never going to openly acknowledge that they sort of see different socioeconomic stratas as in their place, or that some people are just born to occupy a certain type of status and others aren't. And yet the choices that they make do reflect this sort of genetic determinism that underpins the entire enterprise, but it's never explicit. And I think
Yes.
that's part of what perpetuates it.
Yes, I think there's a lot of aspects of politics are like that, not just the genetic part, but
Yeah.
foreign policy.
Right.
We're promoting
Right.
peace and
We're
freedom and
promoting peace and
democracy.
democracy.
Is that
Yeah.
really the case? I say
With
we, the United
guns.
States government. So a lot of times in government, they say they're doing things for certain reasons, but they really have another agenda. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that it kind of makes it easier to understand how the genetic aspect research is misused and promoted by looking at a bigger picture of how a lot of wealthy people run the world, and they would like to have us believe ideas that are consistent with their power and status and wealth.
Yeah.
So, and so if they promote research which claims that people are kind of in their place and we don't need to spend that much on education because certain groups of people are naturally not intelligent and all these things. So we don't. So the education system in the United States is crumbling, underfunded. Young people have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars student loans, some of them, or some of them less. The whole education system could easily be revamped to be the best in the world, but it isn't, because that's a political decision. So I think, getting back to what you said, there was a book in the 90s I like called Inequality by Design. So I like that
Mm-hmm.
title.
Mm-hmm.
Inequality by design, not by genes. So
Yeah. Yeah.
especially comparing groups. And the evidence is not there. So I get into the scientific evidence. The evidence is not there. The twin studies don't prove anything. Adoption studies, reared apart twin studies, do not prove anything about genetics for the reasons I go into detail in my recent writings.
So the adoption data is interesting, because there's this 12-point increase in IQ testing for adoptees who were taken from sort of a lower status family into a
Yes.
higher status family. That would seem to raise all kinds of flags about the whole question of, does the environment matter? If you're seeing a 12-point difference, which is roughly the
Yes.
sort of difference that the bell curve is pointing to between racial groups, and you're seeing that just in how a child is going to thrive in a higher SES family. How sticky is that IQ over the course of a lifetime? Do we know that? Is that something that does persist with I know the heritability of IQ
Yes.
gets higher the older that you get. So the further out of your family environment, supposedly the more heritable IQ is. Is that true for adoptees as well, or what does that look like?
I don't go into that much of a critique in our recent paper, but on adoption studies, because Herenstein and Murray didn't cite those studies specifically, and kind of gave them secondary attention. But I will say one thing. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the Flynn effect.
Sure, and that's the other big problem, right?
This is a huge confounding variable in
Mhm.
all adoption studies and separated twin root apart twin studies, is that IQ, everybody's been getting smarter worldwide, smarter, or doing well on IQ tests, which James Flynn found 3 points per decade, IQ scores are going up. So periodically, the test creators have to re-norm their tests to keep the same average of 100. But if they hadn't, everybody would be scoring 120 or whatever it would be. So that's a really big confounding variable in adoption studies, because I actually just tweeted something about that this morning. If you biological parents and their adopted here, we're just talking about adoption studies, not twin studies, not twin adoption studies. But the studies that you cited are environmentalists tend to cite those studies more, and the behavioral geneticists don't really talk about this much. They talk much more about adopted away children correlating higher in IQ with their biological parents versus their adoptive parents. There are not a huge number of environmental compounds, but just going to the Flynn effect, the average generational difference in years is 25 years. So according to the Flynn effect, the biological offspring of a parent should be 6 to 10 points higher on an IQ test just because IQ scores are raised. They were born 25 years apart.
Mhm.
So that's a huge confounding variable that would really by itself negate any really genetic interpretations of adoptees correlating with their biological parents. The IQ scores rose, so they got better IQ scores just because they were born at a different time.
Right.
So, but the studies that you mentioned too are important, and they do show that if children, these were mainly French studies that were raised by working class or poor parents who were adopted away into upper class or professional families, their IQs went up 10, or 12 or higher percent, 12 to 15%.
Yeah.
Genetic researchers don't like that because it kind of contradicts a lot of their claims about the malleability
Sure, of
of IQ.
course.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, but so that starts to speak to what is an IQ test? What is an IQ test really measuring? Is it just measuring sort of learning, essentially, exposure to institutional learning and the kind of skills that you're going to pick up in a advanced public school system? How much of innate intelligence can an IQ test really measure? Is there such a test that could somehow operationalize such a thing? And what is the state of the debate of what intelligence, or G, even is?
Yes, yes. I'm not going to address that. I'm not an expert on IQ
Okay.
testing, and Ken Richardson, who was co-wrote, is much more of one, and so that was part of in our article.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
that's a huge controversy of what IQ tests measure.
Yeah.
Do they measure innate intelligence? I don't think that they do, whatever that term means. But it all comes from the psychometric tradition. It's all with a lot of genetic assumptions, biological genetic assumptions, that IQ tests are measuring some kind of biological substrate in the brain that intelligence in the brain. But um, that's a huge controversy of what IQ tests measure. So in no way, when I discuss the genetic studies of IQ, am I endorsing the idea that IQ tests measure some kind of innate intelligence. And there's good
Right.
evidence that they don't.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that to the degree that we do have anything that we can use to measure this, it is an IQ test, and it's confounded by the Flynn effect and by all of these other things that we're
Many
talking
other things. And
about.
why are we doing them? What is the purpose?
Right.
We could live in a society without IQ tests. We could focus on providing abundance and things that people need and let people I'm not saying everybody's born equally. I think there's probably some genetic aspect of intelligence differences, whatever that is.
Mhm.
Not, but the research doesn't show it because the research is very bad and confounded. But let
Mhm.
everybody find their place, give material abundance, education, loans,
Mhm.
stipends, all of these things, and really good public education as opposed to what the United States has now, and
Mhm.
let people find their place in life and achieve whatever they want to try to achieve, instead
Mhm.
of looking at IQ and saying these people, we don't have to educate these people, we don't have to do anything for them, we don't have to raise people out of poverty because they're that way, biologically. They're promoted by people who want to emphasize differences among people. So a lot of environmentalists and critique of behavioral geneticists, we emphasize the similarities of people. Most people
Mhm.
have a lot of similarities of people's, things about them. And behavioral genetics likes to find very minute differences and just overemphasize those.
Mhm. So the bell curve, as you talk about in this review article, it's premised on these twins reared apart studies, and
Yes.
in particular the Minnesota study,
Yeah.
and that this has particular methodological problems that have never been sort of really teased out before that you talk about here. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes, I can. And the all the previous twin studies, the twins were really only partially reared apart. In
Mhm.
this study, the same, we can assume because the researchers have never released the raw data for independent evaluation of how separated these twins really were. There's two aspects of why these studies don't prove anything about genetics. One is cohort effect. So this is something that cohort influences. It's rarely discussed by the authors, or other even critics, because any two people who are born at the same time, they grow up, and especially in twins, they're the same gender. So the same gender who born at the same time, so they grow up experiencing similar environments, political, social, IQ, the Flynn effect. They're born at the same Flynn effect moment.
Mhm.
So, or political views or anything like that, that they grow up at the same time and they're influenced in the same developmental stages by the birth cohort they grew up with. Especially, they're usually similar socioeconomic status, culture, religion. So there are a lot of environmental similarities that even perfectly separated identical twins, they could be born, the second they're born, they could be separated and just put somewhere else. There are many environmental influences, cohort influences by any two people of the same gender who were born on the same day and grow up in the
Mhm.
same culture, usually socioeconomic status. So that's one point. That's a huge confounding variable in separated twin studies. The Minnesota studies and the other studies, they all assume that only genetics can explain the behavioral similarity or correlation of reared apart identical twins. That is a false assumption. There are many non-familial environmental effects. The other point about the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, the famous 1990 Science article, which was their main IQ study. Going into that study, dizygotic twins reared apart, fraternal twins reared apart, were the official Minnesota control group. Was designated by Bouchard in 1979. Nancy Siegel wrote about it in her book, her 2012 book on the study. That they had a control group. Now, if you go back and you read the Science article, there are no fraternal twins reared apart correlations or data of any kind in that article. They just eliminated it. Why did they eliminate it? In my opinion, because, in other words, they suppressed their own control group data. Science editors didn't notice or care. Academic psychology hasn't commented on that in 30 years. But if you go back, and I went back and saw some near full sample correlations that many, many years later, they just in passing published, you will see that there is not a statistically significant difference between the identical twins reared apart in IQ, identical twins reared apart and fraternal twins reared apart. There is no statistic, they're the same. Statistically speaking, they're the same. That's a preliminary first step of that study. They have to be significantly different to be able
Right.
to even say anything about genetics. If they're the same, which they are because they don't differ at a statistically significant level, I explain all this in my articles, recent articles. Then that's the first step. It failed at the first step, that you cannot, you would have to conclude that environmental effects raise both correlations above zero, because even though they're identical twins are 100% genetically identical, fraternal twins average 50%, that genetic difference did not make a difference in IQ scores. So at the preliminary first step, the identical twin reared apart index group or experimental group and the fraternal twins reared apart group did not differ. So instead of publishing that and having to conclude that they found no evidence that IQ has any genetic aspect, they just bypassed it and suppressed the IQ correlations of fraternal twins reared apart, in my opinion. And that's a scandal. We're in a replication crisis. Psychology is in a huge scandal of very manipulated, shoddy research. And so this is one example which I try to show in some of my recent articles.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be just an absolute smoking gun for a classic replication crisis problem, where this is one of the so-called the QRPs, the questionable research practices. One of those QRPs is just sort of throwing out data that doesn't, that doesn't serve your purposes. I mean, you point out, and a lot of work that fails replication is often ideologically motivated. It's being driven by scholars who do have a prior commitment to a certain worldview and a certain outcome. And we know from the article that you're talking about and from the study you're talking about that those authors had established themselves as hereditarians and were very concerned about sort of had kind of opinions that are just this side of eugenic type opinions, that we need to have IQ tests for breeding and such things. So yeah, it does, if nothing else, point the spotlight squarely at that work and say, hey, somebody needs to really go all in on this original data and see if it's replicable or not. But that's another problem, is that they don't make the data available. So the original case histories and all of this information is not available to researchers who might want to go back and see if it even can replicate.
I've argued that the study is invalidated for that reason alone, because you can't replicate that study. There's very few, even less and less identical twins reared apart. You couldn't replicate it. So you must have full transparency, which even in the American Psychological Association Ethics Code says there needs to be. So to have any chance at accepting the results of that study, all of the raw data and case history information must be made available, and it's been kept secret. Why has it been kept secret? Two reasons. One is it might show the twins were not really so separated after all. And two, if somebody were to go through and calculate those 1990 control group fraternal twins reared apart IQ correlations, they could see what they were. They would see that they didn't differ from the identical twins. They don't want people to see that, so they keep it data. To this day, they have not published that, and they have not published full-scale IQ fraternal twins reared apart correlations to this day, as we're speaking, to the best of my knowledge. And this should be a scandal.
It should
but
be.
It's not, which speaks to the, let's say, the American Psychological Association, mainstream psychology just lets this stuff go. The same thing in psychiatry. The adoption studies, which are supposedly definitive, the Danish schizophrenia adoption studies are some of the most openly manipulated, p-hacked. We haven't talked about that term, but p-hacking is questionable research practice. It's some of the worst research ever, and it's just rubber stamped by every textbook. So we see that in psychology with the Minnesota study of twins reared apart.
Yeah, people who don't have an academic background don't have a great sense of how the replication crisis propagates itself, because it's not just that you have these studies that, you have some researchers who have some biases, who are throwing things out, or they're doing some p-hacking or whatever it is that they're doing to get the kind of sensational finding that is what is going to get them published. So that's at the root of why this whole thing happened, is because you really only get published if you have a striking finding. If you're saying something, you're very unlikely to get published just saying we didn't find anything, we didn't find an effect. And so that pressure on psychology as a field, on political science as a field, just kind of across the board, is at the root of it. But then you have researchers or authors like Herrnstein and Murray who come along and cite this research without doing a really deep dive into its problematic assumptions or the way that it was carried out. And we can't really know, we don't have a lens into how they were operating, but they're also ideologically motivated. They also are sort of beginning with an end conclusion in mind. And here they find this so-called gold standard study to support those findings. And rather than really dig deep and expose the rotten wood at the foundation of the thing, that gets sort of folded into new findings that get cited by future authors, and the whole thing just continues
without
on.
the caveats.
Especially
in
any
Herrnstein, and also I would argue they don't even know the original research that
That's
much.
what I'm.
Herrnstein in 1971, he jumped into the IQ genetics debate after Jensen reopened it. That's where he came in, an Atlantic Monthly article in 1971. His entire argument, well, mainly it was based on 4 reared apart twin studies, one of which is now discredited, the Burt study. He never read any of those studies. There's no indication that he read any of those studies or analyzed them or scrutinized them. He all based on Arthur Jensen's reading of those studies.
Right.
So if it were 1971 right now and Herenstein had just published that, I would argue I have no evidence that he's ever even read those studies. He didn't cite anything from the studies. He cited Jensen said, Jensen said, Jensen said. In the bell curve, there isn't really that much indication that they really understood how the Minnesota twin. They didn't discuss in detail how they arrived at their conclusions. But there's no evidence they're really that well versed in every detail of the studies that they're citing either.
It's like a really bad game of academic telephone. It's just people are basically acting out of energy conservation because and partly this is just how scholarship has to work, that you're standing on the shoulders of the work that's come before you, and you just are assuming that work was done in good faith. And so people don't go back and check every little thing, and they certainly are not checking and replicating themselves the entire research design. That would just be prohibitive to try to do. So there are norms and assumptions within academic practice that have just clearly been exposed to be absolutely rotten, and are basically bringing all of these gold standard findings into question, and the books that were built on them. So,
and I'm arguing the Minnesota twin study and twin research as a whole needs to be scrutinized in the same way a lot of other studies are. Where there are retraction. I've called for the Minnesota study to be retracted, at least the IQ part of it.
That would be quite a sea change if that were to happen, because it's launched a million ships. It has
cited over 2,400 times. So another thing too is that somebody will do a study, and by the way, until there's recently where they want to pre-register studies, this is a movement. Up until recently, you would just do research and you would go behind the scenes and you would just count and produce any kind of paper you wanted and turn it in. There's no accountability to what you just, how you're going to define groups, what comparisons you were going to make, all of these things. But usually when researchers did those, they would put, at the end, cautions. Here's like 8 reasons why you should be cautious interpreting that. There's problems here, there's problems there. But then when it gets cited in textbook, all the textbooks, all the cautions are gone. Jones found in 1968, blah, blah, blah. They don't say, but he cautioned this and this and this. So then, new generations of students and academics, they read these and go, oh, Jones found that. It was great. None of the cautions are all gone. And that's true. That's absolutely true that most academics and people and students and anybody don't have the time or energy or interest or motivation to go back and read the details of the original studies. We critics do, okay, because we think that it's obviously bad research. So we do go back and reread everything possible, obscure papers, studies. We do that for you, and then we publish our critiques and let people decide whether the critiques or the original studies are right. So
and it's just I'm just thinking of all of the ways that it can continue. Once it's in the textbooks, now it's absolutely unassailable, and then once it's transmogrified into a meta study too. So the great celebrated Polderman meta study is bringing in all of this work that is, again, very problematic at the root, and then you aggregate it into a meta study, and now the finding of the meta-analysis is also in question. So it's okay. So the other, this is all research that has kind of come before all of these, the twins reared apart, twins reared together. But now we have this kind of new frontier of molecular genetic research as well, that is also looking like it's bringing some of the original estimates into question, and that these estimates of something like IQ, which the bell curve is putting at 60 to 80% heritability. And again, that whole heritability conversation and what heritability even is sort of too much for us to get into here, but it does not mean what you think it means for the most part. But just the idea that it's a strongly heritable characteristic, that looks like it's a much lower estimate by these newer methods of assessing genetic influence, something more on the order of 10 to 15% maybe of genetic influence. What have you discovered there, and how has that informed this critique as well?
Yes, there's a huge difference. And also those studies are all based on associations, correlations. So they're not finding genes that are shown to cause a difference in IQ or schizophrenia or any of these things. They're associations. Associations can be spurious, meaning that they're caused by a third factor. So
Mhm.
there are associations, they're not causal genes. Even Thomas Insel, who's a kind of well-known researcher
Mhm.
authority, in 2022, he wrote, "No causative genes for psychiatric disorders have been discovered." So the
Mm.
GWAS era, genome-wide association, GWAS, started in 2007. So that everything people have read from there and polygenic scores, these are correlations, associations. They're not in any way proven to have any causal relationship to the characteristic under study. But one revealing aspect, before genome-wide association studies, from around 1990 to 2015, we had the candidate study gene era. So
Mhm.
this is when they would find a candidate gene that plausibly has some relationship to the characteristic. For example, schizophrenia, a gene that regulates something in the brain. And they would do a study, and that all hundreds, probably thousands and thousands of studies, finding all of these genes for everything: schizophrenia, IQ, personality, bipolar disorder, everything. And they were publicized in the media, the New York Times, all gene discovery, university press releases. Well, the candidate at thousands of claims, it all collapsed in the late 2015 to 2020. Uh, the whole candidate gene era collapsed. If you go back and look at that, you can compare it to the current era because we're seeing the same thing.
Mm.
Thousands of claims of genetic associations, media reports, documentaries, all of these things. Well, we had the same thing in the candidate gene era, and before that, the linkage era, and it all collapsed. And I believe this one will collapse too. So, especially in psychiatry, there's no evidence that any psychiatric condition diagnosis has a genetic underpinning, in
Mm.
my opinion. There's no evidence for that. So, therefore, I would predict that they won't find any genes for any of these for psychiatric conditions. And
Mm.
they haven't found any genes that cause a psychiatric condition. They've just found associations, which sometimes are fishing expeditions. P hacking, it's another. I mean, if you look for all these genes and then you find some that are significant, that's kind of a classic fishing expedition P hacking technique, where you just circle the ones. I'm kind of paraphrasing Eric Turkheimer on this one.
Right.
Kind of a behavior geneticist with a critical bent. You're just circling the ones that are significant, and that's not how you do science. And these
Right.
studies are specifically promoted as being hypothesis free. But if it's hypothesis free, you're just anything that pops up as a significant finding, you just circle it and say, oh, we found something. But most likely
Right.
it's by chance or population stratification, other confounds in these studies, which I won't get into
Right.
in detail right now.
Right. Yeah, if anything, a fishing expedition like that is a potentially a hypothesis generating effort where,
Mhm.
yeah, you find something and you circle it and you say, okay, there's a strong correlation here. Let's hypothesize, whether that's a causal connection or not. And then you investigate through some method to be determined. Do you have an
Yes.
idea of what that would even look like for the future of this kind of research? Like if there was some sort of ideal way to suss out this infamous nature nurture question, and we did find a strong correlation with some of these genetic flags.
Mhm.
How might we go about sussing out the genetic influence there on something like
Well,
schizophrenia or another psychiatric disorder?
you're absolutely correct. That should be a preliminary study. Here are the ones we circle the significant genes associated with condition, and then you would use that as to generate a hypothesis to then do further research. So I think sometimes they claim that they do, but I'm not saying that they don't. But I couldn't. I'm not an expert in molecular genetics, so I couldn't really say, what's the best way to go about that. I might question the usefulness or the purpose of doing that kind of research. For example, intelligence is going. IQ scores have been rising 3 points per decade. Maybe that's slowed down recently, but when
Mhm.
James Flynn did his research. So there's obviously tremendous things in the environment and the adoption studies you mentioned. Education, environment, nutrition, alleviating poverty, all of these things. Why do we need to really look for genes for IQ, which they haven't found, or schizophrenia? There's a lot of environmental risk factors for schizophrenia, Not that really there is such a thing as schizophrenia. Psychosis is a better term.
Right.
Depression. Why are so many people in the United States depressed? This is the richest country in the world. What, 25% of the country is on antidepressant? I don't have the exact. There's obviously aspects of society that are psychologically unhealthy, that don't allow people to grow, to meet their potential. Income distribution, huge differences, all these things. So what's the point of doing genetic research? Some people will call me anti-science for saying that, but you don't have to research. I mean, what is the point? Improve the environment, make society a just, equal place of abundance for all people to strive to do whatever they want to do in life, and full employment, all these things. And you don't have to do genetic research. And even if they found a gene that plays a role in causing schizophrenia, which they haven't up to now, what would that mean? What would they do? I know they would say target a medication. I don't really think they're going to be able to target a medication.
Exactly. I
Yes,
mean,
yes.
it's the relationship with big pharma, and then straight to the CRISPR lab with you. We'll do some genetic editing because we found that you have some sort of genetic liability, and now we can either give you some sort of medication that can take care of that for you, or we can do some sort of ad hoc gene editing on you. I think that's where the money is, right?
Yes.
That's where the research goes. And so the quest continues to identify these magic bullets to
right.
And there's also huge money in the people want to know if they're at risk. People want to know if they have the Alzheimer's gene, or if they have the alcoholic gene, or there's huge marketing potential for playing on people's fears around that, and for letting them, if they feel like they're really vulnerable and at risk, well, I have a solution to sell you of all kinds of different things. So there is, I think, huge pressure on that keeps that engine going.
Right, but they don't find any genes. That's they just keep it going because it's an industry. The drug companies need it to kind of promote their drugs, because if you have a biological genetic disease, then you need it's much easier to justify medication than if it's socially or environmentally caused. So they finance this research. All the research, most of it is biological, genetic, in psychiatry, for example. That doesn't mean there's anything there. So there isn't, but they keep looking because it's just an industry that just keeps on going because it makes money for people and drug companies. A lot of people do the research. If you read the new conflict of interest statement, they're on boards of pharmaceutical company consultants. They never actually say how much money they get. I think that's very interesting.
Right.
Somebody's a consultant for this Pfizer. Well, how much do they get? $10? Are getting $10 million a year? I really would like to know that, as I'm reading their research. It's very unlikely they're going to determine that antidepressants are not very useful if they're getting paid by the drug companies to say that they are. That's just, confirmation bias. It's not all corruption. We all have biases. I have biases. Everybody has confirmation biases. Fine. We're human. We have opinions. We have entrenched beliefs. All these things. People have careers built on it. There's no problem with that. The problem is it gets denied.
Exactly.
Minnesota twin researchers, their confirmation biases has nothing to do with their conclusions. That's not true. They're human beings. They have biases. They already believe that IQ is substantially genetic before they even did the study. If you read Bouchard book chapter in 1976, he already said IQ is mainly genetic, and pretty much you inherit your IQ. So that's fine, but it should be acknowledged and recognized that these biases exist, and they affect how people, what they study, what they conclude, how they interpret data. Then it would be a lot better than massively pretending that nobody's biases or confirmation biases or financial conflict of interest have anything to do with their conclusions, which is not true.
Yeah, and the direction that academic research has taken to everybody is so siloed into their own little universe where they just cite each other and they use their own work and they circle the wagons around the original research. And so that bias that everybody has, I mean, it made a huge impression on me. My first class in grad school as a comparative political scientist, the professor said, first question out of the gate in the seminar, why do we study the countries that we study? Because comparative political scientists usually specialize in one region of the world or another. And nobody could answer it. And I raised my hand and said, well, because we care about them, because we're interested in that place, because we like the language, or we like the food, or we're attracted to their women, or whatever it is. Like, that's the reality of why people have a particular draw to a particular region in the world. And if you're ignoring that and kind of holding yourself up as some kind of objective arbiter of reality, and that other group over there, they're the ideologically captured, confused, they don't know what they're talking about, then just science goes nowhere. That you never talk to each other, you never create that bridge and actually have any discovery. So it's very, very discouraging.
The myth that science is separate from politics, it just operates separately in its own objective world, which is completely untrue. People have beliefs, how they get they get financed and they get grants and rewarded for doing certain things. And all of this, science is very much politics and science. You can't deny it. That's just part of life. And denying it only causes problems.
And once you've built a career, defending it in a certain particular way, you're not going to pivot and then start to question all of the research that built the mountain that you're standing on. You're very unlikely to change your mind once you achieve a certain amount of success and notoriety in a discipline.
And I think some critics, like myself, we kind of work outside of academia. So I do not hold an academic post. If I were an untenured professor in a psychology department, I would be kind of reluctant to be saying
of course,
Minnesota studies should be retracted. They suppress their control group, all of these things. It probably wouldn't be good for my career to do that.
Of course.
So that's just the way it is. So in that sense, some critics are not having that pressure. They're more free to really show the severe flaws in these studies.
Yeah, I want to be respectful of your time, but I know people will be curious about your thoughts, and you don't have to get into this if you don't want to, but just, if there is no kind of smoking genetic gun for something on the continuum of psychosis like schizophrenia or these other disorders, what do you point to as the origins of those kinds of disorders, and what kinds of policy recommendations would follow for trying to address that before they manifest with people?
Yeah, that's a good question, and psychosis is a very difficult one. I did cite in my recent book on schizophrenia and genetics several investigators who have linked psychosis to early life trauma, deprivation, sexual abuse, immigration status. So there are many documented aspects of what can cause psychosis. On the other hand, it's a little more mysterious than some other things. So I think we have to look at some aspects of society. What is it? A certain amount of, because there are some young people who grow up in privileged backgrounds and they didn't experience any of these things, and they become psychotic in college or some. I mean, that's a difficult one to just say why. I know why that happened. Not the non-genetic reasons why that happened. So I think the point is we need to look. Here's the way I would like to put it, and I always put it for psychiatric condition. We need to look outside of the body. Psychiatry, psychiatric genetics, they want to look inside the body for the explanation. For example, why that college student became psychotic. They want to look inside the body, your brain, your genes, even some it's your gut. I know there have been studies like all these things. They want to look at your brain, inside of your body, to say, here's why this happened. And myself and many other environmentalist critics, the answers lie outside of the body. So I can't say specifically exactly where I would direct research, but I would be outside of the body. It would be in society, the family, pressures of young people in this particular epoch in society to do certain things. I would look outside of the body. That's where research should go, outside of the body.
And that is what we cannot link a pill to that, unfortunately. So the drive to fund that research is very low.
It's not profitable, and it also might uncover some very unhealthy psychological aspects of societies where people develop psychosis too. So, that's where I would direct research in that area, because in that particular aspect of psychosis. Depression is kind of different in a way. That's pretty obvious. A lot of things, stress, anxiety, depression, stresses, financial, society, war, all of these things. social isolation, especially in the United States. People report much fewer confidants. People are more isolated and lonely. All of these things. That's not as mysterious as, say, psychosis, which I'm not saying it's completely mysterious because there are risk factors that have been identified, but still outside of the body. What is it about this society that's causing people in the most affluent society in history, at least total gross national product, 25% of the people to be depressed, half the kids on some kind of medication. I don't have that statistic, but a lot, so what is it about this society that makes people unhappy, psychotic, anxious? That's where I would want to look. But that's a political question, because then you get into the politics, income distribution, all of these things. If you locate it in somebody's body, then you don't have to change any of that. And there's no evidence that's in the body. That's the thing, including brain disorder, which are brain disorder in psychiatry does not necessarily imply genetic, by the way. So it's a little bit different, but there's no evidence for that either. So they usually get the cause and effect backward. If the brain is functioning not right, it doesn't mean that it's caused by something. It means it's reacting to the environment. But anyway, yes, what were you going to say?
No, just this is the, I think, the chickens coming home to roost of neoliberalism. This idea that any kind of pathology is within you, and the system itself is perfectly fine. And if you're not happy with it, then that's a you problem that you need to fix.
Exactly.
And there's going to be some way to monetize the way that you need to fix it, whether it's through the kind of, one of my hobby horses is the commodification of mindfulness. This whole idea of what the West has done with mindfulness and the idea of meditation. And it's just kind of parlayed it into this other way to remain a functional member of a dysfunctional society. And rather than look at this context that you're in, whether that is the broader political system you're in, or even just the immediate context of your life and your community and your family system and all of that, which is outside of the body, that still is going to have really dysfunctional effects on you. So
a lot of genetic researchers talk about what they use the term the societal burden of mental disorders, the cost and the lost workout. I would reverse that and say what we have is the mental burden of societal disorders. That's the way I look at it, and it's confirmed by the evidence that's claimed of biological genetic causes of dysfunction, depression, psychiatric conditions. There's no evidence for that. The evidence is all weak, confounded. It's very bad research, and we have a replication crisis, so it needs to go to the next step and really show how this research of genetic research is really bad, and it needs to be retracted, much of it.
Wow. Great. Awesome. Any parting words, or what do you want people to kind of take away from your critique of Murray or any other current work that you're doing?
I would take away just that the genetic evidence of intelligence differences is very weak and confounded. And as you mentioned, the molecular genetic studies, flawed as they are coming in dramatically lower heritability estimates, to use that term. So that would tend to, they have a term for that, the missing heritability problem, the difference between twin study heritability and molecular genetic. I would call that a twin study problem. It's not a missing heritability. It's a twin study problem. There needs to be an objective scientific committee dedicated to objectively looking at the assumptions and methods of twin studies, because twin studies are the main support for all the genetic theories you hear about everything. Psychiatry, personality, IQ, everything, medical conditions, twin studies. So that's why I keep talking about twin studies. That's the foundation.
All rests on that.
Mainly. Not completely. I wouldn't say it all rests on it, because there are adoption studies and there are other kinds of studies. But the foundation of all of it is twin studies. And that's what really society needs to look at, instead of every textbook rubber stamping somebody's conclusion based on false assumption, including, you mentioned the Polderman meta-analysis. If you have one study that's can't prove anything about genetics because of the assumption is false. So if you find 3,000 of those studies, what do you have? You have 3,000 studies that have based on false assumptions. You don't have a finding that needs to be saying this is a definitive proof of genetic influences. So
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe I'm ending on the Polderman meta-analysis, which most people have never heard of, but basically they took a whole bunch of twin studies and tried to say something about them. Nothing in that article mentioned anything about the equal environment, identical fraternal equal environment assumption. It wasn't mentioned that all of these studies are based on a very long time controversial assumption, which there's no evidence in favor of, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah. The takeaway from that article, the shorthand that people will have from that meta-analysis is that everything is heritable. Everything is super heritable, like 60% at least, and that's what people are left with without, again, looking at what did
Yes.
you feed into that machine to get that result.
Right. Based on the assumption that identical fraternal twins grow up in experiencing the same environments.
Yeah.
Nobody believes that. Everybody knows that assumption is false. Twin researchers know that assumption is false.
Right. And that's just the idea that people treat you differently based on, that identical twins are going to be treated very similarly because they present in the world in an identical way than fraternal twins who are going to be treated differently. This is just a very basic intuition
Yes.
that just gets ignored in this,
Yes.
in that assumption.
And levels of attachment and identity confusion. So they experience identity
Right.
confusion.
Right.
They
No,
grow
that's
up together. They're together more often. They're kind of two halves of the same whole. So it's very understandable they would behave more similarly than fraternals. Yes. Many other aspects of that. So,
yeah.
so that's the point I want to leave is twin research. So for people out there listening, read some more critiques of twin research, my critiques, other people's, and that's just to know that even though it's reported in every textbook and article in the corporate media, I will call it the corporate media, out there, that if you really look at the assumptions of these twin studies, there's really nothing there, and people should be more critically look at, even though everybody's saying it, because it is gospel, right? It doesn't mean it's true gospel, but it's presented that way. That people read the critics more and to really see that these studies are very problematic and the theories are problematic.
You have a quote in the article referring to it as the emperor has no clothes. This idea of the twin studies, it seems like there's so much there, and then when you really start to pull it apart, the emperor is naked in front of the crowd. So we just need children to point it out.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. There's lots of other little tendrils of conversations that we could have that I would love to pick your brain on, but we will wrap for today. And I will put your contact information in your website so people can find your current work and reach out to you in the description below. And we will hope to have you back soon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation, and it's my pleasure to be able to chat with you. And you have some of your own ideas and observations are very astute too. I wanted to just mention that.
Thanks very much.
It's been really nice having this conversation. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.